The Americans started training 4 rebel groups in the forest in Guinea to overthrow Chastila. So I started myself to look at the other side of the war to see what was happening. So my reporting was very counter to the general news coming out of Liberia from the Western media. Again, in Zimbabwe, exactly the same thing happened. The Western media, because the white people who had stolen the land in Zimbabwe and from the blacks, from the ancestors of the blacks, Mugabe and his people are now saying, give us some. And if we are not going to give, we'll take it willy-nilly. So as soon as this program started in 2000, the white media, the Western media, drew a line in the sand and said, we are going to support the white farmers. So as a black person who was living in the UK at the time, I decided that, okay, I'll look at the other side of the war. What was the truth? And we found that the black people of Zimbabwe were right in taking back the land. So I threw my whole spirit behind these black people who were taking back their land.
Incredible. But did you feel like you were just one person shouting into the storm? Because the white media is so massive, like with what America being able to just take down Charles Taylor, put him in jail. I'm reading on Wikipedia right now about the things he did that he was tried for. And I don't see genocide. I don't see him killing masses of people, according to Wikipedia. Maybe I'm mistaken. They said war crimes, but I don't really see it here compared to the stuff that we're seeing today with our eyes from Israel.
The Americans started, the prosecutors all came from America. Yeah. They started with 27-point indictment. And it was so comical that they had to shut it down to 21 and to 11. Yeah, so from 27 to 21 to 11 points indictment.
Why did they reduce it then? Because it didn't make any sense?
It didn't make any sense at all. America just wanted to lump everything on him to get him in jail. So the 11 points, they found him not guilty on all the major points. They found him guilty on a minor point of aiding and abetting.
Did he aid and abet?
He helped them with some weapons and things like that. Aiding and abetting got him 50 years in jail. You can see on Wikipedia that there was nothing that could hold him onto, but the Americans wanted him in jail. And it's 50 years there.
That's the thing. We see these double standards existing throughout history and currently too. If they have a goal, even if it doesn't make sense intellectually, they will find a way. What I was wondering, a bit like what Hamid was saying, I wanted to follow up on the fact that Western media is so dominant. Everybody gets their news from the West. And you're this alternative voice and alternative narrative. What inspired you to maintain that alternative voice, but to even start? Was this something from a very young age, or is this something that you thought post you having to flee Ghana that you wanted to do?
Yeah, I think you're right. You take me to my young days. Now I have a bald head. When I was young, my first name was called Baffour Ankomah. And it bothered me so much as I was going through school. I kept asking myself, have I ever seen a white man called Kwame? In Ghana, we have Kwame, Kofi, like Kofi Annan. Why was I Francis? Before I entered the School of Journalism, I changed my name. I dropped Francis and I chose Baffour. Baffour is the title for warrior kings in Ashanti. And I told myself, I'm going to be a warrior with a pen. I'm going to use my pen to fight the causes of Africa. From a very early age, these days, I look back and I said, wow, I was quite radical then. So I changed my name and went to tell my dad and said, I'm not more Francis. My father was a catechist in the Catholic Church and he never liked it. He didn't like it. But I chose Baffour pointedly to be a guide. And so as I grew up and became more enlightened, fighting causes for Africa became a second nature to me. That would be the answer. From a very young age, I saw myself as a warrior. Using my pen. And when Zimbabwe issue came out, yes, New African became a lone voice. And I became a lone voice. And I pushed it to a point where the Western world nearly killed New African. We are based in the UK, like New African, which is a Pan-African. Our major sources of advertising were white companies, multinationals, who had businesses in Africa. But when the Zimbabwe issue came and then New African latched onto it as a major issue, all of them withdrew their advertising.
Oh, wow.
It started with Mercedes-Benz, who said, we don't want to advertise in a magazine that supports violence in Zimbabwe. But it was not violence. These are African people whose land have been stolen by a few white people, and they wanted their land back. So they took their land back. It started with Mercedes-Benz, then Japanese car makers all withdrew, DHL withdrew, all of them withdrew, to a point that in 2005, I remember, and I always say that was the lowest point in my journalism career. The proprietor of New African called me to his office one day and asked me, Baffour, this Zimbabwe thing you are doing, what is it in it for us as a company and for you? Mm-hmm. And Hamid, I had no answer. I had not thought about it. The New African was now publishing with almost no adverts at all. And we were suffering. For the first time, we could not even pay our correspondents. So I didn't have any answer for him. I looked at him blankly. And then in the end, we agreed that we have to tone down on the Zimbabwean coverage.
Wow. So it just goes to show.
Yes.
The backlash you experienced and how they kind of cornered you in a way to try to silence you or censor you to a certain degree.
Exactly.
But just like you said with your name, you continued to resist up until today, where you're doing the work that you do.
Yes, and I'm continuing with the third eye. We are doing some wonderful historical pieces. This started 2 years ago by the president of Zimbabwe, who said, Pan-Africanism is dying. Let's get a magazine and start talking about Pan-African issues. Yeah. So we started it here in Zimbabwe. It's now going into universities in South Africa, trying to circulate in the Southern African region. We want it to be another New African within a year, so that we can send copies to the UK for people to see what we are doing down here.
Amazing. Yeah. No, that would be lovely. That would be lovely, definitely.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a lot of people interested in reclaiming or just getting more knowledge on sort of their heritage. And I think we need to shout about these things so that more people have access to it. And hopefully this is one of the ways. Right, Hamid?
I agree. Because I'm thinking about the fact that these companies had to basically start withdrawing their support for New Africa just because you were supporting the Black people of Zimbabwe and their rights to their own land. And you were just a magazine. You weren't even like a YouTube channel. You weren't massive. You were big and you had influence in certain areas, but you weren't like Sky News or BBC News.
No, we're not, yes.
You weren't that big, yet it still affected you. I would have thought they would be like, oh, New Africa isn't that big. We don't need to penalize them. But no, it seems they're penalizing regardless. And it reminds me of what happened recently to African Stream. So there's a media platform on social media called African Stream, banned from all social media platforms by the US. And they're not even that big. They weren't crazy. They didn't have millions and millions of followers. They were just starting to rise up and they were shut down. It seems like history repeats itself over and over again.
Yeah, and I think they shut you down before you even get big. That's the tactic. So even though on one hand, Hamid, it's like, oh, well, they're not as big as other popular media platforms. I think that's it, catching it when it's growing to stop it from flourishing.
Yeah. You also remember in the 2000s, we didn't have social media as it is today. And 24-hour news, was there. But at the time, there was a hole for New African to be effective and impactful because most Africans will wait for a month their copy of New African. And as I go around, like yesterday, I saw some guy, his house, he has New African packed there. He will read and pass on, and they'll read and pass on. In that sense, it was effective, and the Americans will not want a thing like that. Interestingly, I meet people here, and they wonder why the British did not move any hand to say, arrest me or do anything to ban New African. And I said, maybe it's because the British were showing that they are really democratic, because we're right in the belly of the world. Our office is in Colbert Square, which is off Farringdon Road here. We're right in the middle of central London. And they did not raise any hand to try to stop us from reporting the counter view. I remember there was only one time where Tony Blair was then Prime Minister. We were trying to interview him for one issue of New African. He agreed to write a piece. We know somebody was going to go sit for him. In the end, he said no. The interview, he changed to a piece, which I think somebody might have ghosted it for him. So we ran the issue, we ran the piece in the New African issue. It came out that very week when it came out. Tony Blair was going on a West African tour, and he carried along with him all the other African media based in the UK, apart from us at New African.
Why?
I never understood it, because we asked him to write a piece, and he wrote about his African policy, wrote about Zimbabwe, wrote about West Africa, and he was going on a West African tour, Ghana, Sierra Leone. He carried the other African journalists with him on his plane. Never asked, we're not invited.
Is it because you guys were the only ones supporting the Zimbabweans for the right to their own land?
Yes. There was no African magazine at the time in the UK doing what we did.
Interesting.
We were mad about Zimbabwe.
Yeah. You guys were like, you were on it. You guys were like, no, we're not leaving this topic. We're going to support our people.